Okay, this morning I'm going to uh, show a couple things that have to do with system performance and getting more out of OPENTOONZ. The first thing I'm going to show, okay, so this has to do with maybe you're in a post-production sort of mode. In this case, I have a scene that has probably at least a dozen shots in it, each of it in its own level, and then each level is essentially a sub-x sheet containing many other levels. So it gets big and it gets complicated. And I've learned two things this morning that do help with that process of getting things rendered out, and let's just get right to it. In the earlier shots that I did in this project, and I'm going to go ahead and show this exact process. What I did was, for example, here you can see that each major shot comprises a level, and then I can just, in my case, I've got a hotkey control down arrow goes down into the sub-x sheet, and then I can work with it. So you'll notice that this sub-x sheet begins at frame 118, but once you go down into it, it starts at frame 1. Now this is actually maybe more important than you might realize when it comes to doing renders and whatnot later. The reason it's pertinent to rendering is that if you hit Shift Control R and do a full-blown render of 1,000 frames, it's pretty axiomatic that OPENTOONZ is going to crash. And you can look at it in the task manager and see that it's consuming more than 2 gigabytes of memory, which tends to, I've seen the same thing happen with Sony Vegas. It's not like a rule, because as you can see, I have an instance of OPENTOONZ right here that seems to be consuming 2.3 gig of memory. So it's not a tried and true rule, but I've seen it many times with applications dealing with video and whatnot, where the project's getting much larger and it gets to be render time. Once the task manager shows the process kicking up and over 2 gig of memory, it often tends to cause a crash in Windows. It's just not a real uncommon thing. So getting back to my point, when I created this sub-x sheet, the beginning of this shot did in fact begin at frame 118. So in other words, if I have these miscellaneous frames over here, and I say I want to take these two levels, this one starts on frame 668. If I took these two levels and turned them into a sub-x sheet, if I go into the sub-x sheet, that too would start on frame 668. So the advantage of leaving it there is that when you go into the sub-x sheet, if you were down on this frame, you go down into the sub-x sheet, you're already where you need to be to go ahead and get to work. From the standpoint of creating preview ranges, like where you select this frame and you set a start marker, you go down and go to that frame and set a stop marker, so that when you hit the L key, you can loop, what you're looking at and preview it. What I'm finding is if you leave those frames where they are in the main X sheet, then as you're working through the project, you're going to find yourself having to jump back and forth. Well, if you take those frames that are in the sub-x sheet and move them back up to frame 1, you're still going to have to jump around. In other words, you're going to be jumping around when you're navigating in and out of X sheets. You're going to be jumping around if you have a really long scene like this is, consisting of several shots. So given that we can't get around the problem of jumping around, then we ask ourselves, well, what's the most intuitive workflow, and what gets me to the end result quicker or more efficiently or more reliably? Because what I'm finding is, as animators, we think animating's all about, drawing and animating. In an anime, it's really surprising how true this is proving to be. Is that a lot of the shots literally consist of a single drawing. I mean, I've got this shot here, for example, where, granted, I use the plastic tool to create some secondary animation. And by the way, that secondary animation got voted out. I liked it, but we wound up taking it off. But the point is that um, the secondary animation added a little bit of shake to his muscle, so it looked like he was struggling a little bit to hang on, right? But beyond that, the whole shot literally only has 3 keyframes. And so the question becomes, where are you spending all your time? The truth is, you're spending all your time navigating in and out of X-sheets, dealing with the schematic view in order to add effects, like here. If we go over here, you can see how all these are routed together. If I go down into that sub-X sheet, in this case, this actual shot doesn't seem to have a lot of effects, so that's probably not the greatest example I could grab. Let me grab this one, and we want to be in the effects. So you can see in this one we've got image adjustments, we've got an overlay here, we've got soft light combo mode, and a lot of times there's blurs, but I mean, the point is, this is actually where you wind up spending your time, is trying to fine-tune the image, add some details, and make it look good. That's where your time goes. So what I'm getting at is, how do you optimize that so that it's, as I said, both intuitive and fairly efficient, and lets you just keep moving forward and do what you need to do? All right. So the answer is, increasingly, I'm finding it makes sense to do what I described, where you take your sub-X sheet and I don't want that in preview mode, by the way, and you move all the cells actually to the top. So this starts on frame 365, so that's easy because there's 365 days in a year. So that's easy to remember. So I'm going to go down into the sub-X sheet, and before I go too far, I'll tell you why I'm going to move these all to frame 1. The reason is that OPENTOONZ seems to get confused. If I go to frame 365 and I hit the L key so I can loop it, so I already set the start frame and the end frame for the loop region. No problem. And you can see this is the same thing. It's got a little plastic tool adding a little bit of little vibration there. It looks a little stupid because it's looping right now, but when it's cut into the scene, it goes by in it's not less than a second, but it's barely a second. So it goes by really fast, and it actually looks pretty good in context. So just saying. But here's what's interesting. On a 1,000 frame shot, if I were to go File and do a full render here, I've found that there's a lot of things about it that are a little problematic, but OPENTOONZ definitely can't render out the whole scene. That's for sure. Now you could render it in pieces, and that's fine. It actually makes a lot of sense because you want ultimately to have each of those shots probably as a separate image sequence or video file, so you can bring them all into your final editor, and possibly do some manipulation with those shots later in the game. In point of fact, there's no question that that's what you're going to want to do. In my case, I have been using Sony Vegas for years and years, and so let's go ahead and let's create a preview range here. So the good thing about Vegas, for me is, beyond the fact that I know it really well, is that it's very performant. I could add a lot of post-production effects here, and the performance of it is going to be considerably better than working directly in either OPENTOONZ or, honestly, Blender or anything else. I mean, Vegas is a very good performant program. So the upshot being that since we're definitely going to break the scene into several shots and render them separately, then the question becomes, how do we want to go about that so that it's going to be the most we're not going to be running into weird idiosyncrasies of OPENTOONZ, for one thing. And well, let me show you what that means in practice. What I'm getting at is if I hit this loop range, and it probably won't do it now, right? Because now that I'm actually recording this. But here's the problem. If I jump to, okay, actually two problems. Number one, I've asked myself, well, what if I do all my effects here in the preview mode kind of thing, and then what if I want to do like a quick render where I don't even use post effects? So I don't, and this shot's unusual in that the final preview quality rendering of the image actually looks pretty darn close to the non-rendered version, if you will, the real-time version. And that's only because I was using my paintbrush and various painterly effects to try to get to the final look without having to do a lot of work in the schematic with added effects and all the rest. So that's kind of neither here nor there, but the point is, when I switch this into, okay, actually, to finish my earlier sentence, here's the problem. If you're not in preview mode, which is obviously slower, quite a bit slower in many cases, you cannot take your preview range and save these images. As far as I can tell, and if somebody's out there and they know the answer to this, let me know. As far as I know, in the preview mode like this, that's very real time, it's very quick, there's no way to take these images and render them out. Okay, unless you did something really hokey like screenshots and all this kind of stupid stuff. So you have to be in preview mode in order to get a preview cached into memory, and most significantly about that is you can hit this little icon and actually save the previewed images as an image sequence, and basically you're done. You've rendered it. You don't need to do the actual official render step, which just opens a little dialog window, and I haven't done it a lot because when I tried it again, it crashed OPENTOONZ repeatedly. However, as far as I know, it's almost like a little dialog box that just kind of says, hey, we're working in the background rendering your project, end of discussion. You don't see it. Whereas here, if you hit the preview, you can see the frames being cached into memory. And now here's the problem. I hit the loop key, and yeah, like I said, what it did repeatedly before I started this video, it won't do now. So it has something to do with maybe whatever I was looking at before I went into this sub-x sheet. But here's the basic problem I was running into is, if I set a start and end frame and go ahead and just play through it, then you can see as this red bar turns to gray that these frames are now stored in memory. That's what you can save out as an image sequence. So now if I hit this button, and I'm going to hit the L key to stop that. If I hit this button, now I can go in here and save these images. Okay, and as you can see, it's I was going to say it's really quick. It's only quick because it jumped from frame 1 up to frame 365. So we're getting away with it now. We're saving out just the frames we were interested in. That is not what happened earlier. Okay, what happened earlier was that OPENTOONZ wanted to insist on storing images going back to frame 1. So what would happen is in the, I want to call it preview mode. To me, the really fast mode, I call that preview mode, but OPENTOONZ calls the rendered mode preview mode, so it's the nomenclature's a little wacky. But in the fast mode, which is the default that you see when you're working with OPENTOONZ, unless you click this little eyeball so you can do the official preview. What was happening is it would loop from 365 to whatever the last frame is. But every time I would put it into preview mode, it would jump back to frame 1. I'm thought, well, that's kind of stupid. And then, worst of all, when I would hit save out the images, it would want to go back and save from frame 1. So now it's going to take half an hour just to save, 30 images. Because it's not saving 30 images, it's saving almost 400 images, right? Which makes it additionally problematic when I'm going to go and bring that image sequence into Vegas, because Vegas doesn't understand where the image sequence is supposed to start. So in this case, I've got from this image up to this image that are all erroneous from OPENTOONZ trying to save the wrong thing. Okay, so how do we get rid of this stupidity? Here's how we get rid of this stupidity. First of all, let's go back here. And it appears that OPENTOONZ is kind of sort of locked up. That's okay because I didn't actually save this. I'm not going to lose any work by doing this. So I'm going to show you in a second how to move everything back up to frame 1 so it makes a little more sense. But before I do that, I want to show you something else that's extremely significant. Right now I have multiple instances of OPENTOONZ running. And they each have different preview ranges that I'm using to generate the image sequences so I can bring them into Vegas and do my editing. And quite probably color correction as well, which is far more efficient in Vegas than in any other application I use. Now this goes back to the days I can remember when I was doing like corporate video projects where I had to generate multiple DVDs of events that were hours long. And I had multiple instances rendering, just like I have now. I've got multiple instances of OPENTOONZ rendering, and they're each rendering a different set of images from the shot. Once I save them, once I'm rendering out those image sequences, I'm putting each image sequence in a separate folder, and then those folders full of images get imported into Sony Vegas so that you can actually do your editing. So each image sequence effectively acts as a separate video file, because Vegas treats them as a single clip. Well, if you've spent any time on a technical level with Windows, you know that the sharing of CPUs, thread management, yada yada yada, in Windows is basically stupid. It's comically sad how inept Windows is actually at managing symmetric multiprocessing and all the rest. But the upshot of it is that what Windows will do is it'll take OPENTOONZ and it'll say, OPENTOONZ, you're not necessarily a multi-threaded, multi-CPU designed program, or maybe you are. We don't really know if you are or not. We're going to take you and we're going to divide you among all the CPUs. Okay? So now if I go in the task manager to the details of this process, and if I were to go to set affinity, it lets me decide the default like all the time, the default with Windows is it's going to use all your processors. This machine has 12 processors that are numbered from 0 to 11. Okay, and then what happens is, and I've seen this many times, what happens is if you have multiple instances of Vegas or OPENTOONZ running, they will all use all the processors. And in effect, the more instances of it you have running, the more the computer will kind of sort of bog down. Now what's interesting about it is that if I take one instance of OPENTOONZ and I say, no, I'm going to only let you use CPUs, the last 2 CPUs. Then I go to this instance of OPENTOONZ and I do the same thing, but I pick 2 different CPUs. So now it's only using 2, whereas previously it was using 12. A very interesting thing happens, and by the way, going back about, I would say, 8 years, going back to when I had a quad-core machine. What I'm about to describe to you, I have never seen it fail. It always works out this way. Number one, when you put the application on only one or two CPUs instead of the default, which is all of them, the performance doesn't change a bit. It does not slow down at all. In other words, that application is actually only using effectively one CPU, which means that symmetric multiprocessing and all the rest really is not well integrated into the application, or else it's not doing a good job of communicating to the operating system how it wants to do that. The upshot is that I have very rarely seen this fail. I think Blender's better, by the way, when it comes to rendering in that aspect and how it uses multiple CPUs. But with OPENTOONZ, with Sony Vegas, it's the exact same thing. The application rendering on one CPU is just as fast as running on 12 CPUs. And guess what's most interesting about that? Multiple instances of OPENTOONZ, each running on one or two CPUs, they will each run equally as quickly, whereas if you had multiple instances all running on all 12 CPUs, it would gradually bog down. Not only that, so what this shows you is that the switching off from one process to the overhead of switching from this process to that process, so it feels and looks like you have multiple things going on at once, is actually implemented. It was probably implemented by a duck, sitting on a pond somewhere near Redmond, Washington. Because, not that I don't mean to insult ducks, because it's not like ducks are stupid. They can do some amazing things. They can fly. But whoever implemented it in Windows, it was implemented as stupidly as possible. I mean, they could have done it in a really brain-dead way, where just in round-robin fashion, every application that runs is only assigned to one CPU, and it just kind of goes around the clock until there's too many applications running, and then you have to start assigning them, back to the same CPU again. That would perform much better. The entire Windows operating system would perform much better, because what I've seen time and time again is that processes that are segregated to only a certain CPU, where they can't bump into each other, performance shoots up and the crashes shoot down. You get less crashes and better performance. So if you've got to go into this rendering mode, it makes a lot of sense. And literally, I just saw it a few minutes ago where I had two instances of OPENTOONZ running. They're both rendering, and it's kind of like boom, boom, boom. And then I put them each on their own CPU, and then now it's like boom, boom, boom. It sped up visibly. It was palpably faster. Okay, so having said that, this has rendered, so I don't need that open anymore. I will go ahead and save all, even though I may regret that. In this shot, actually, I'm going to go ahead and save all again, because the last one I saved, I definitely know I had changed some things. Okay, so as far as getting multiple instances rendering, my strong advice, if you want performance, is to go into the task manager, and what you do is you go to your processes, you go to each of your applications you're running. So here's Firefox. What you do is you go to the details. So that takes you to the actual process, and then from the process you can set the affinity. Okay, so if I take Firefox and I say Firefox is going to be on CPU 11, I will almost guarantee you that the performance of Firefox itself is not going to be hampered. In fact, it's probably going to be better. Like if I take OBS now and I put it on CPU 10, I'm probably going to have greater stability from both OBS and, say, Firefox. If I was live streaming right now, which I'm not, I'm just recording this, but if I was live streaming, I can almost guarantee you that all of a sudden we're going to have less system instability. Everything's going to be a little bit more stable, and I've seen that time and time again. So that's a really good trick if you've got to take a multi-CPU machine and try to get better performance out of it. So now back to OPENTOONZ. This issue I brought up about OPENTOONZ not knowing where to start doing the preview render, I'll show you how that is solved. It's, you know, it's an extra step you have to take, but what I'm finding is the shots where I did it this way, it makes more sense because they're all the same. They always start at frame 1, right? And not only that, but also I should say that if I'm not mistaken, when you render them, okay, that one I would expect to start at frame. Yeah, see, that starts at frame 0 as well, and so does this. So I'm pretty sure that those other shots I actually rendered from inside the sub-x sheet, so they started at frame 1. And that's basically what I recommend. When it's time to render, go into the sub-x sheet and just render that. Don't be out in the main X sheet where you're having to navigate down to a certain frame number and all this sort of thing. So what I'm going to do is go here. Let's go down into that sub-x sheet. Okay, this is a shot I'm interested in. And this is the extra step you have to take. It's a little bit of a pain, but I'm finding it's worth it. So I'm just going to grab all the shots. And if I was starting out the scene, I would have done this with every other shot. This is what I did first. So, and I'm just going to take this. You could do it a lot of different ways, but let's see what happens if you cut them. It'll probably kill all the levels. Yeah, it did. Yeah, see, that's a little problematic. Control Z. Okay. And by the way, this also shows you why you want to do it early in the process. Because the problem I'm going to have right now is when I drag these clips around, these keyframes are going to get left behind. See? So, hence, when you're dealing with sub-x sheets, I recommend you just do this right off the top. Very first thing you do is move all your frames back to frame 1. So let's just patiently do that. Okay, and now these keys, actually I should probably take this one as well. Let's just cut it and paste it. Yep, and should be able to do the same thing here if I go from frame 365. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to cut it, and this is the plastic tool. And paste it. Everything looks good. Okay, so now I'm going to save this. So the problem is when I come up out of the sub-x sheet, you can see these are all red, and the reason for that is it needs to be resequenced. Okay, it needs to resequence so that it knows where the actual pertinent frames are. So I'm going to hit resequence, and I believe, okay, honestly I'm not really sure why this worked, because I was really thinking that what I was going to have to do is go up to the top, grab the frames from there and drag them back down. So that's actually kind of cool that it worked out the way it did. Okay, so what that does for me is it allows me to go down into the sub-x sheet, and basically whatever I'm working on, generally I can have a preview range that starts on 1. It's just kind of more convenient. So I tend to like to press this button here that makes it so I only see what the camera sees. Okay, I'm going to go to preview mode, and now I'm going to hit L. And what it's going to do is it's going to cache all those frames into the preview, and then I can save the image sequence very quickly. I mean, very quickly. We'll see how long it takes, but it should be pretty snappy. So, okay, that's looking good. And I believe, going back to, okay, so this would be shot 5 actually. So I'm going to hit the L key to stop this. Oops. I made a boo-boo. I hit the L key while I had my mouse on Vegas. So I'm going to come back here, hit the L key, and let's just save these guys. So now what I need to do is go to, it's unfortunate I sort of have to browse to this every time. OPENTOONZ doesn't really seem to remember the last place you were. So this is shot 5, and it looks like it already got rendered. So let's take a quick look at that, and my suspicion is that the frames are going to be starting on 365, which isn't a big deal. You could rename them using another little handy-dandy utility program I could show you. But yeah, see, this starts at 365. Okay, so significantly, this shot hasn't changed since it was rendered before, so I'm going to just take the opportunity to show you another. Actually, we want to save all since we moved the sub-x sheet around. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to list view, and actually details is what I prefer. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this other little utility, and this is called the AF5 renamer. So you can look it up, AF5 renamer. It's quite slick. You can take a batch of images, and it'll deal with very large sequences of images. Okay, and this is Akari's Dream Scene 5, and I've already got the counter, and I wanted to have a period, so OPENTOONZ will recognize it, and instead of starting at 0365, it's going to start at 0000, and I'm leaving the extension unchanged. So I hit rename, and it literally takes 1 second, and as you can see, all of these got renamed appropriately. So AF5 renamer, especially for dealing with image sequences and large batches of files. Maybe you've got a folder full of a bunch of pictures, and you want to have them all have a common name. Perhaps with you know, like I just did, where you have an image sequence type of numbering system. But that AF5 renamer is very useful for that sort of thing. So now what I want to do is go into Vegas, and I want Akari's Dream Shot 5, and I'm just going to click the first. Actually, you can't see this, can you? Browsing down to Akari's Dream Shot 5, I'm going to grab the first image. Vegas can tell that it is an image sequence, and open that up, and now I have an image sequence that I can drag into my timeline, and I'm going to actually move this up and out of the way. Okay, so now we have that shot in there. I've got to add the fourth one as well, and I don't want to keep dragging Vegas around. What I really should do is use the OBS capability to switch between them. So like right now, which is pretty cool. I just need to get it all set up so I've got all three screens available to pick from. So now back to OPENTOONZ. I want to look at shot number 4. So render. Did I render that? Yes. Alright, and that's 33 frames. So I won't bore you with the details of switching the sub-x sheets back up to frame 1 anymore. I think I've explained that pretty clearly. So at this point, what we need to do is go ahead and deal with shot number 6. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that one, I don't know if that one is a sub-x sheet yet. Looks like it is. Okay, and it's this shot. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing again, and then after that I'm going to end this video. So I'm going to go down into this sub-x sheet, and as you can see, it begins on frame 386. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these frames, and I wish I didn't have to drag them, but the reason I have to drag them as opposed to just cutting and pasting is I need to test this, but when you cut and paste them, the levels actually disappear, and you probably can just paste them back in, but I'm just not really sure. So that would seem to make sense. Okay, so now this I can cut and paste. Go up here, and it'll be interesting to see if it again mapped it properly. I'll show you what I mean in a second. Okay. Okay, so now if I resequence, my question is it going to take those frames and put them up to frame 1 and then I have to move them back down? Or is it going to actually put them where I want them to be? I don't know. Let's find out. Resequence, and it did what I wanted. Okay, that's awesome. So that means I can be here at frame 306, or 86. I can go down into that sub-x sheet, and look at that. That's actually, it's even more slick that when I go into the sub-x sheet, OPENTOONZ knows that I want it to be back up here at frame 1. Not too bad. That's very useful. All right. Very good. Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to end this video because this was really all about performance and stuff. And this guy needs to be like painted, and I need to put the background in and everything else. So I think with that, I'm going to end this video, and I'm sure I will probably be back. If not today, then certainly tomorrow.